The morning sun painted streaks of orange and pink across the Denver International Airport as Captain Lee walked through the terminal, his crisp uniform drawing respectful glances from early travelers. The weight of his flight bag felt familiar on his shoulder, a comfortable companion after 15 years in the cockpit. Today's flight to Seattle looked straightforward on paper: clear skies, mild winds, and a full but manageable passenger list. As he made his way through security, Lee exchanged warm greetings with the ground staff he'd come to know over the years. The smell of coffee from nearby cafes mixed with the distinct airport aroma of jet fuel and anticipation. This was his favorite time of day, the quiet before the rush, when he could focus on his pre-flight routine without interruption. In the cockpit of the Boeing 737, Lee settled into his captain's seat, the leather still cool from the night air. His fingers moved across the instruments with practiced precision, each switch and dial as familiar as the keys of his home piano. The morning checklist was more than just protocol. It was his meditation, his way of connecting with the magnificent machine that would soon carry hundreds of lives safely through the skies. The first officers and flight attendants trickled in, exchanging quiet good mornings and updates about the upcoming flight. Lee listened carefully to their briefing while continuing his preparations. His attention caught on a small detail, a note about a large group booking that had been made last minute. Experience had taught him that group bookings sometimes brought unexpected challenges, but nothing his team couldn't handle. Through the cockpit window, he watched the ground crew loading luggage and completing their own thorough checks. The sun had fully risen now, turning the mountains in the distance into purple silhouettes against the brightening sky. A light dusting of snow from the previous night made the scene look like something from a postcard. The sound of passengers boarding filtered through the cabin. Lee could hear the usual shuffle of feet, the thump of carry-on bags being stored, and the murmur of conversations. Everything seemed normal, routine. Just another day in the life of a commercial airline pilot. He pulled out his weather charts one more time, double-checking the forecast for their route. The winter weather system they'd been monitoring had moved east, leaving them with clear flying conditions all the way to Seattle. What Lee couldn't know, was that this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become anything but routine. As he finished his final checks and prepared to close the cockpit door, he had no way of knowing that his years of training, including skills he hadn't used since his military days, would be put to the ultimate test at 35,000 feet. He adjusted his headset and began the familiar radio exchange with ground control, his voice carrying the calm authority that had earned him the respect of crews and passengers alike over the years. The morning sun caught the silver wings pinned to his uniform, a reminder of the responsibility he carried. Today's flight time would be 3 hours and 45 minutes, assuming everything went according to plan. But in aviation, as in life, plans had a way of changing when you least expected them to. 3 hours before the flight, the Denver airport's usual morning calm was shattered by the rumble of motorcycles in the parking structure. 5 members of the Thunder Raiders Motorcycle Club pulled into the short-term parking, their chrome-covered bikes gleaming under the fluorescent lights. They'd been riding all night to make this flight, celebrating what they called a successful rally in a nearby town. The group's leader, a tall man with a graying beard and weathered leather vest, stumbled slightly as he dismounted his bike. The night's celebrations were still evident in his unsteady movements and loud voice that echoed through the concrete structure. His fellow riders weren't in much better shape, laughing too loudly and speaking in voices that carried far more than necessary. At the check-in counter, the situation quickly became tense. The airline staff member, a seasoned professional with decade-long experience, kept her composure as the bikers argued about their carry-on bags. "Sir, I understand your concern, but these items exceed our size limitations," she explained patiently, gesturing to their oversized leather bags. The leader's face reddened as he leaned over the counter, his breath carrying the stale reminder of the previous night's activities. "Do you know who we are?" he demanded, pointing to the Thunder Raiders patch on his vest. We've never had problems before. These bags stay with us." Other travelers nearby began to distance themselves, parents pulling their children closer, business travelers pretending to be absorbed in their phones. Security officers noticed the commotion, moving closer but maintaining a careful distance. The bikers' reputation preceded them. They weren't known for causing serious trouble, but they had a way of pushing every boundary they encountered. One of the younger riders, sporting a fresh tattoo on his neck, kept pacing back and forth, his boots making heavy sounds against the terminal floor. After 15 tense minutes of negotiation, the airline supervisor made a decision to avoid further escalation. The bags would be carefully gate-checked, allowing the group to proceed through security. But this small victory only seemed to embolden the bikers. They made their way through the TSA checkpoint, making inappropriate jokes and taking their time removing their heavy boots and multiple pieces of jewelry. At the gate, their presence created an invisible divide in the waiting area. Other passengers clustered away from them, their discomfort evident in sidelong glances and whispered conversations. The bikers sprawled across several seats, sharing loud stories about their rally and making comments about passing travelers that walked the line between humor and harassment. When boarding began, they ignored the usual process, pushing their way forward despite not being in the current boarding group. The gate agent, a young man working his first month on the job, felt his heart racing as he tried to maintain order. "Gentlemen, we're currently boarding Group A only," he managed to say, his voice barely steady. The leader's response was a dismissive wave as he pushed past, his companions following in his wake. Other passengers exchanged worried glances, some already pulling out their phones to record what they sensed might become an interesting situation. The air in the jet bridge felt thick with tension as the group made their way toward the aircraft, their heavy boots echoing in the enclosed space. What started as a routine morning was quickly becoming something else entirely. As they approached the aircraft door, none of them realized they were about to encounter someone who would change the entire dynamic of their journey. The Thunder Raiders had intimidated their way through plenty of situations before, but they had never encountered someone quite like the pilot who was finishing his pre-flight checks in the cockpit ahead. 30 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and the real trouble began. The cabin crew had just started their beverage service when the first signs of disruption rippled through the cabin. The Thunder Raiders, seated in the middle section of the aircraft, were already showing signs of restlessness that made other passengers increasingly uneasy. The head flight attendant, a veteran with over 20 years of experience, approached their row with her usual professional smile. She'd handled difficult passengers before, but something about this group's energy felt different. As she reached their section with the beverage cart, the leader of the group raised his hand, demanding attention. "We need something stronger than soft drinks," he announced loudly enough for several rows to hear. "And make it quick. We're celebrating." His companions chuckled, creating an atmosphere that made nearby passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. A young mother in the row ahead pulled her headphones closer, turning up the volume on her tablet. The flight attendant maintained her composure, her voice steady and professional. "I apologize, sir, but I've observed that your group appears to be under the influence already. FAA regulations prevent me from serving alcohol to passengers who show signs of intoxication." She kept her tone polite but firm, a skill honed over countless flights. This response wasn't what the bikers wanted to hear. The leader leaned forward, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper that somehow seemed louder than his previous demands. "Listen, lady, we paid good money for these tickets. You can't tell us what we can and can't drink." His friends muttered in agreement, their leather vests creaking as they stirred in their seats. A businessman across the aisle pretended to be absorbed in his laptop, but his fingers had stopped typing. Other passengers began pressing their call buttons, creating a symphony of gentle chimes that told the crew something wasn't right. The tension in the cabin was building like a thunderstorm on the horizon. The flight attendant stood her ground, her hand steady on the beverage cart. "Sir, this is a safety issue. I'm happy to serve you any non-alcoholic beverage of your choice. She gestured to the selection of sodas and juices, maintaining eye contact despite the growing hostility. One of the younger bikers stood up suddenly, causing several passengers to gasp. "You don't understand who we are, do you?" he said, pointing to the patch on his vest. The Thunder Raiders don't take no for an answer. His attempt to be intimidating was somewhat undermined by the slight sway in his stance. The plane wasn't experiencing any turbulence. Another flight attendant, sensing the escalating situation, moved quickly to support her colleague. She pressed the intercom button, making a coded announcement that alerted the cockpit to a potential situation. The bikers didn't realize it, but their behavior had just been officially logged and reported to ground control. The leader's face reddened as he realized they were being denied. He grabbed the armrest, his knuckles whitening. "This is discrimination," he declared loudly. "You're treating us like criminals just because of how we look." His voice carried through the cabin, causing a child several rows ahead to start crying. What should have been a routine beverage service had transformed into a powder keg waiting for a spark. The flight attendants exchanged glances, their years of training kicking in as they prepared to handle what was clearly becoming a serious situation. They couldn't know it yet, but in the cockpit, the captain was already formulating a plan, one that would soon remind everyone on board why air travel has strict rules, and why it's never wise to challenge those who enforce them. What the Thunder Raiders couldn't know, as they continued their disruptive behavior, was that the calm and collected pilot in the cockpit was far more than just a commercial airline captain. The story of his past would have made them think twice about causing trouble on his aircraft. Before joining the airline, the captain had spent 12 years in the Air Force Special Operations Command. His missions had taken him to some of the world's most dangerous places, where he'd learned to handle situations far more threatening than unruly passengers. The quiet confidence he carried wasn't just from flying commercial jets. It came from landing aircraft under enemy fire and evacuating civilians from conflict zones. In the cockpit, he kept a small photo tucked away in his flight bag. It showed him standing next to a helicopter in a desert landscape, surrounded by his former unit. That photograph was a reminder of the years he'd spent conducting high-risk rescue operations, where staying calm under pressure wasn't just a skill, it was the difference between life and death. His training hadn't stopped at flying aircraft. The Air Force had invested heavily in teaching him advanced conflict resolution techniques. He'd learned how to diffuse hostile situations in confined spaces, how to read body language, and most importantly, how to take control of a situation without escalating it to violence. These weren't skills he expected to use on commercial flights, but he maintained them just as diligently as he did his flying abilities. One particular mission had changed his approach to handling confrontations. His team had been tasked with evacuating a group of aid workers from a rapidly deteriorating situation. Instead of using force, he'd managed to negotiate with local leaders, turning potential enemies into allies. That experience had taught him that authority comes not from intimidation, but from calm, clear communication and unwavering confidence. The captain had also undergone specialized training in handling hijacking attempts and terrorist threats. While the rowdy bikers were far from terrorists, the psychological principles he'd learned applied to any confrontation. He knew exactly how to project authority without aggression, how to give people a way to back down while saving face, and how to take control of a situation without anyone getting hurt. In the years since joining commercial aviation, he'd kept his skills sharp through regular training sessions and workshops. His airline had actually brought him in as a consultant to help develop their crew resource management programs. Many of his techniques for handling difficult situations had become part of the standard training for new flight crews. What made him particularly effective wasn't just his military background. It was his understanding of human psychology. He knew that most people who acted tough were usually covering up their own insecurities. His experience had taught him that even the most aggressive individuals usually back down when confronted with calm, professional authority that gave them no room for escalation. As the reports of the bikers' behavior reached the cockpit through coded messages from his crew, The captain began mentally preparing his approach. He wasn't worried. He was ready. This situation was far from the most challenging he'd faced, but he would treat it with the same methodical, professional approach he'd used in far more dangerous circumstances. The Thunder Raiders were about to learn an important lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous person in a situation isn't the one making the most noise. Sometimes it's the quiet, professional individual who has seen enough real conflict to know exactly how to end it. As the captain finished reviewing the situation reports, he knew exactly what needed to be done. Years of training and experience had prepared him for this moment, though he hadn't expected to need these particular skills on today's flight to Seattle. 2 hours into the flight, the situation reached its breaking point. The Thunder Raiders had grown increasingly restless after being denied alcohol, their frustration building like pressure in a sealed container. The leader kept pressing his call button repeatedly, creating an annoying chime that echoed through the cabin every few minutes. A young flight attendant was making her way down the aisle, collecting trash from passengers, when one of the bikers suddenly stood up, blocking her path. He towered over her, his leather vest creaking as he stretched to his full height. "First class has a whole bottle of champagne up there," he growled, pointing toward the curtain dividing the cabins. "I can see them drinking it from here." The flight attendant's hands trembled slightly as she held her trash bag, but her voice remained steady. "Sir, please return to your seat. The seatbelt sign is on." She was right. The captain had illuminated it minutes ago, anticipating trouble after receiving reports of the group's escalating behavior. Instead of complying, the biker took a step forward. "I paid for my ticket, just like those folks up front," he said, his voice rising. Other passengers began to stir uneasily in their seats. A businessman in the row ahead quietly started recording on his phone, keeping it partially hidden behind his magazine. The leader of the group stood up next, ignoring the seatbelt sign. "If you won't serve us properly back here, we'll just help ourselves." He gestured to his companions, 2 of whom immediately rose to join him. The flight attendant backed away, pressing herself against the opposite row of seats to maintain distance. An elderly couple seated nearby clutched each other's hands, their faces pale with concern. A mother a few rows back pulled her sleeping child closer, shielding the young one's face against her shoulder. The tension in the cabin had become almost palpable, like the heavy air before a storm. The bikers began moving toward the first-class curtain, bumping into seated passengers without apology. When they reached the divide, the leader yanked the curtain aside so hard that one of the rings holding it popped off the rod. The sound made several passengers jump in their seats. A flight attendant in first class saw them coming and quickly pressed the emergency call button to the cockpit. 3 short buzzes followed by a long one. It was a code that every crew member knew meant immediate assistance was needed. The lead flight attendant stepped forward, positioning herself between the bikers and the first-class cabin. "Gentlemen, this is your final warning. Return to your seats immediately." The leader's face darkened with anger. "Or what?" he challenged, taking another step forward. "What are you going to do about it? We're at 35,000 feet. Ain't no cops up here." His friends laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the tense atmosphere of the cabin. What the bikers didn't realize was that their actions had just crossed a critical line. In the cockpit, the captain was receiving a steady stream of updates about the situation. As he listened to the final report, his expression remained calm, but his eyes took on the focused look familiar to anyone who'd served with him in combat situations. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but the Thunder Raiders had just forced his hand. It was time for them to learn that at 35,000 feet, the captain's authority was absolute, and this particular captain was uniquely qualified to enforce it. The captain's voice came through the intercom first, steady and clear. "This is your captain speaking. I'm turning the aircraft over to my first officer." The passengers felt a shift in the air, knowing something significant was about to happen. The Thunder Raiders exchanged confused glances, their aggressive posturing momentarily forgotten. When the cockpit door opened, the captain emerged with a presence that commanded immediate attention. He moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had handled far more dangerous situations. His uniform was crisp, his posture perfect, but it was his eyes that caught everyone's attention. They held the calm, steady gaze of someone who had stared down real threats. As he made his way down the aisle, passengers noticed how he moved, each step precise, his hands relaxed at his sides. He wasn't rushing, wasn't showing any signs of anxiety. The bikers, still clustered near the first-class curtain, watched his approach with growing uncertainty. Something about his bearing made their usual intimidation tactics feel suddenly childish. The captain stopped a few feet from the group, positioning himself so that all 5 bikers were in his line of sight. He didn't speak immediately, taking a moment to survey the scene. His silence carried more weight than any shouted order could have. A few passengers had their phones out, sensing that whatever happened next would be worth recording. "Gentlemen," he finally said, his voice carrying easily through the cabin without being raised. "I've been monitoring the situation, and we need to have a discussion about federal aviation regulations." He gestured toward the empty row nearby. "Please take your seats, and we'll talk about how this ends." The leader of the Thunder Raiders, still trying to maintain his tough image, attempted to sneer. "We don't take orders from." But his words trailed off as the captain took one step forward. There was something in the pilot's stance, a subtle shift in his posture, that made the biker instinctively step back. The captain reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his airline ID, but anyone watching closely could see the military bearing in how he held himself. "Actually, at this altitude, you do take orders from me. Federal law is very clear about that." His tone wasn't threatening. It was simply stating facts with absolute certainty. He activated the plane's internal security protocols with a small device in his hand, a movement so casual most passengers didn't even notice it. But the soft click of recording systems engaging was unmistakable to those paying attention. "Right now, you're facing a choice. The next 30 seconds will determine whether you're met by local police or federal agents when we land." The younger bikers looked to their leader, their earlier bravado crumbling in the face of such calm, professional authority. The captain stood perfectly still, his presence filling the aisle more effectively than any physical barrier. The entire cabin held its breath, watching this silent battle of wills play out at 35,000 feet. The tension broke when one of the younger bikers suddenly sat down, followed quickly by another. The captain hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made any threats. He had simply taken control of the situation with the kind of authority that comes from real experience, not from leather vests or loud voices. The captain's next moves were calculated with precision, born from years of experience. Standing in the aisle, he addressed the Thunder Raiders with a voice that carried authority without aggression. "I've handled situations in places where mistakes cost lives," he said quietly, ensuring only they could hear him. "This doesn't need to be one of those situations." His words caught their attention immediately. The leader's eyes narrowed, reassessing the man before him. The captain continued, his tone conversational but firm. "Right now, there are 3 federal air marshals on their phones at our destination. They're waiting to hear from me about whether they need to meet this flight." He pulled out his phone, showing them a real-time flight tracking display. "Every action you've taken has been recorded. Every threat, every attempt to intimidate my crew." He swiped through several screens showing security footage from the cabin. "The FBI takes these incidents seriously. They have a 98% conviction rate for airline interference cases." The younger bikers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their leader, still standing, looked less certain than before. The captain pressed his advantage, but not with threats, with options. "But here's what we can do instead," he offered, his voice taking on a problem-solving tone. "You return to your seats. You write formal apologies to my crew. You follow every instruction for the remainder of this flight without question." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Do that, and when we land, you walk away with a warning. No federal charges, no permanent flight ban, no criminal record." His offer hung in the air, a lifeline thrown to men who were just beginning to realize how deep they'd gotten themselves. The cabin remained silent as the bikers processed their options. Other passengers watched, phones still recording, as the leader's tough exterior began to crack. The captain stood patiently, his posture relaxed but ready, a stance familiar to anyone who'd seen military personnel in tense situations. "You were special forces, weren't you?" the leader finally asked, his voice quieter now. The captain nodded once, not elaborating. His silence said more than words could. The leader looked at his companions, then back at the captain. Understanding passed between them. The understanding that they'd picked the wrong flight, the wrong crew, and definitely the wrong pilot to challenge. The leader's shoulders dropped slightly, the first real sign of submission. "We'll take the deal," he said, trying to maintain some dignity. The captain nodded again, producing a notepad from his pocket. "Start with the apologies," he instructed. "Make them sincere. My crew deserves that much." As the bikers began writing, the tension in the cabin finally began to ease. Passengers who had been holding their breath slowly relaxed. The captain had managed something remarkable. He'd diffused a potentially explosive situation without a single raised voice or physical confrontation. He'd done it with the kind of quiet confidence that comes not from seeking conflict, but from knowing exactly how to end it. The mood in the cabin shifted dramatically as the Thunder Raiders returned to their seats. The leader's hand shook slightly as he finished writing his apology letter, a humbling experience for someone who wasn't used to admitting mistakes. His fellow riders followed suit, their pens scratching against paper in the now quiet cabin. Other passengers watched in amazement as the same men who had been causing chaos minutes ago now sat quietly, their earlier bravado completely deflated. The captain stood in the aisle, reviewing each letter as it was completed. His presence remained calm but watchful, like a guardian keeping peace in his domain. A flight attendant moved through the cabin with fresh drinks, all non-alcoholic. This time, the bikers accepted their sodas with mumbled thanks, avoiding eye contact with both the crew and their fellow passengers. The transformation was so complete that some passengers exchanged wondering glances, impressed by how thoroughly the situation had been diffused. The captain read each apology carefully, nodding at the sincerity he found in their words. These weren't just hurried scribbles. The bikers had taken time to acknowledge their actions and express genuine remorse. One letter specifically mentioned respect for the crew's professionalism in the face of their behavior. Another apologized for frightening other passengers. A young passenger, maybe 10 years old, watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. The captain noticed and gave him a reassuring wink as he passed by. It was a small gesture that showed the human side of authority. Firm when needed but kind when possible. Several rows of passengers smiled at this moment of connection. The leader of the group, looking somewhat deflated but relieved, finally spoke up. "We were out of line," he admitted, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Got carried away with ourselves." His words carried the weight of someone who had just learned a valuable lesson about real authority versus attempted intimidation. As the captain prepared to return to the cockpit, he paused by their row. "Everyone makes mistakes," he said quietly. "What matters is how we handle them afterward." His words weren't just for the bikers. They carried across the cabin, a lesson in dignity and professionalism for everyone listening. The remainder of the flight proceeded in perfect order. The Thunder Raiders kept to themselves, occasionally exchanging glances that spoke volumes about their shared experience. Other passengers gradually relaxed, some even sharing quiet conversations about what they'd witnessed, a masterclass in handling confrontation without escalation. The first officer's voice came over the intercom, announcing their initial descent into Seattle. The bikers fastened their seatbelts without being reminded, now model passengers. The transformation was so complete that a businessman who had been recording earlier put away his phone, deciding the story's peaceful resolution was more impressive than its confrontational beginning. As the plane touched down in Seattle, 2 police cars and an FBI vehicle were visible on the tarmac. The Thunder Raiders watched nervously through their windows, But the captain had kept his word. After reviewing their sincere apologies and noting their complete compliance for the rest of the flight, he'd made the call. They would receive warnings instead of federal charges. The other passengers deplaned first, many of them pausing to thank the captain who stood by the cockpit door. An elderly passenger squeezed his hand and whispered, "In all my years of flying, I've never seen anything handled so professionally." The flight attendants exchanged proud glances, knowing they'd been part of something remarkable. The Thunder Raiders were asked to stay behind briefly. 2 FBI agents boarded the plane, their faces serious but not hostile. The captain had shared his assessment of the situation, how the group had crossed a line but then showed genuine remorse and cooperation. The agents took down their information and delivered stern warnings about airline safety regulations. As the bikers finally left the aircraft, their leader turned back to the captain. "I served too, you know," he said quietly. "Army, years ago. Somewhere along the way, I forgot what real leadership looks like. Thanks for the reminder." The captain nodded, a moment of understanding passing between them. The story spread quickly through social media. Passengers' videos of how the situation was handled went viral, though many commented that the most impressive part wasn't the confrontation. It was how it had been resolved without any violence or arrests. Airlines took notice, and within weeks, the captain was invited to help develop new training programs for handling difficult situations. The most significant change came 6 months later. The airline industry began incorporating military veterans' conflict resolution techniques into their standard crew training. The captain's approach that day had demonstrated how combining authority with understanding could diffuse even the most volatile situations. The Thunder Raiders' story became a turning point for their club too. The leader, impacted by his experience, started a mentorship program pairing veteran bikers with younger members, teaching them about respect, dignity, and real strength. Their reputation in the motorcycle community gradually shifted from troublemakers to community leaders. A year later, a documentary filmmaker interviewed the captain about that day. When asked about his calm handling of the situation, he simply smiled and said, "Sometimes the best way to show strength is to give others a chance to show their better nature." The clip became a training video for flight crews worldwide. The incident had turned into something more than just another story about unruly passengers. It had become a lesson in how understanding, professionalism, and the right kind of leadership could transform potentially dangerous situations into opportunities for growth and change.